I just want to remind people of a few housekeeping things first. Hopefully you got your name tags. If not, we'll get you one. And if you could fill out if you're interested in CEUs, the form is in the back there. Nancy's been taking care of that for us. So forms are in the back. Also, we met this morning, our R&D committee, and we're working on our spring calendar, which you should hear about soon, probably beginning of December. So we're really excited. We have a really great lineup of various events throughout this May that we're already sort of planning. So I'm not sort of planning, we are. And it should be exciting. So be looking for that in your mailboxes, email boxes, and such. We're grateful today to have Dr. Tim O'Malley with us. He is the director of the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy and a professor in the Department of Theology. He is a double domer, first in 2004 with a BA from Notre Dame, and then in 2006 with his master's in theological studies. He recently completed his doctorate in liturgy and catechesis from Boston College. He's here with Boston College. Just sort of an afterthought, right? Okay. You'll be wearing...
I'll go anywhere that pays me. That's
okay.
my kind of
and
philosophy.
You'll be wearing what colors tomorrow?
Yeah, there's not even an option, gold and blue. I wear the same thing under my doctoral robe. I don't...
Oh.
I want closest to my heart.
Okay, great. He has spoken nationally on matters related to liturgical formation, prayer, and theology of Christian experience. He's currently revising his dissertation for publication, and he is married. His wife, Kara O'Malley, is Director of Christian Formation at St. Joseph Parish. Please welcome Dr. Tim.
This seems a bit too formal, though it may not work. But I know Layla has to move the camera every time I move, and I move a tremendous amount, so I apologize, Layla. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm very thankful that a group like this exists. Part of my own doctoral work, I did some work in kind of Catholic higher education and the study of kind of Catholic identity amongst schools and such. So while there's much discussion about what constitutes something like Catholic identity, to have a group of people gather together responsible for it in its various forms, the actual practice of it, to me is kind of a cool thing. It's better than just simply talking about it. It's actually doing something in which a group of people across a university actually get together and do that. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm thankful to be here. And I was asked, in some sense, to speak just a little bit on liturgical seasons and things like that. And I don't have much prepared because it's not really a complex thing necessarily, though it has a potential to kind of reconfigure how we think about time. Hence the name, Numbering Our Days Aright, for kind of the title. Just a quick something to draw out. A little bit of a distinction quite early on between ancient and Judeo-Christian notions of time and how time moved. In the ancient world, in the Greco-Roman world, time was cyclical. So everything occurred once again, and kind of this great cycle in which one time would occur again, and another time would occur again. And so in a lot of the ancient works that you read things about fate and the inescapability of fate, because our lives have been chosen before time, and we're simply in some miserable cycle in which the same thing will happen again and again and again until the end of the world. And that this is kind of a notion of time that's deadly, or not very pleasant, obviously, because what are we doing with our lives right now if it's all kind of just a scripted play that, you know, it's Hamlet's thing, our lives are over like a sigh, or Macbeth, 70 years for those who are strong, or no, that's the Psalms, never mind. I have a number of things memorized. But tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. See, that would be what the kind of Roman conception of time would lead to. On the other hand, Christians and Jews had a very different notion of time. That is, God has become involved in history. That God has acted in historical realities, changing it such that what has occurred in the past matters for today, but is never to be repeated. Maybe perhaps done again in a new way, or they'll refer to it, Irenaeus, a theologian, a fairly early theologian in the 200s, will refer to it as recapitulated, to put another head on it, to do it again. That might be the understanding of time that you have, but you don't have an understanding of time as kind of inescapability, of fate, of what many students today might talk about as karma. The kind of, they mostly believe in karma, even though that's wrong. So there's a sense in which it really is a kind of interruption, that this notion of time is something radically new can happen that can never happen again. Obviously, this is a problem for the liturgical year because at Christmas, are we celebrating Jesus being born again? Are we celebrating Jesus' birthday? Or are we celebrating something else? Is it like, happy birthday, Jesus, let's roll out a cake, blow out the candles together, and as if it happens every time that we gather? Or is there another type of time that's happening? And I think there is another type of time that's happening. The other thing about time is, see, we're humans, as it turns out. So immediately, kind of Christians, they knew that something radical happened, and that it didn't matter. It happened in the past, and it had a present effect for the rest of existence. And so it wasn't like Christians would gather together and celebrate the birth of Jesus anew each year, because there were groups in the ancient world that did that. They were called mystery religions. And a mystery religion would get together on a kind of yearly basis, and the god would be born again. Whether it was the god of the Nile, so that each time that the river overflowed and flooded the land, and then thus making it fertile, the god was born again. And so you would celebrate the birth of the god. And you would initiate people into this cult so that they could escape this miserable fate and become friends with this god. Christians very specifically didn't want to believe that, obviously, for some good reasons. And so there was a different notion of time operative, that there was a different understanding of kind of what the celebration of seasons mean. That there was a kind of initial reluctance to celebrate, for example, there was no initially, very, very early on, no initial celebration of the Feast of Easter, as in like a yearly celebration of when Christ died and rose again. That was an initial kind of non-concern. But the thing is, we're human, and we can't think of everything at the same time. Go ahead, try to think about everything in your life right now at the same time. Like at the same time. Don't think about it historically or what happened yesterday, but think of everything that's ever happened to you at the same time. Go. Okay, you didn't. You know why? Because you're human. You have a mind. And your mind can only think of one thing at one time. And so there's a kind of, isn't that what a good teacher learns immediately? That you can't tell your student everything, but you have to kind of lead them into it. That there's a kind of slow divine, there's a slow pedagogy, not divine in my case, but just a pedagogy. In the case of God, it's a divine pedagogy, a pedagogy that gradually appropriates people into the fullness of this narrative so that they can understand it more deeply and more deeply appropriate it as they undergo a year. And so you have an Augustine, who I did my work on, so I know him quite well, that quote under 1b, which is that this time somehow enters into us because we need specific times to respond to. We need signs to respond to. Our heart is his altar when it is lifted up to him. We plead to him by his only begotten priest. We offer bleeding victims to him when we strive for his truth, even to shedding blood. We burn the sweetest incense to him when we are aflame with holy and pious love in his sight. We consecrate and we return his gifts to us in our own person. And this is the really important part. By solemn feasts and dedicated days, we render sacred and proclaim the memory of his benefits, lest by the passing of time, ingrate forgetfulness might creep upon us. So that as we kind of, the liturgical year unfolds, it presents for the Christian a kind of life of Christ, because we can't think of Christ's life entirely at the same time. But we can think of moments. And moments, like little mysteries of a life, communicate something to us. And that by contemplating them, something is changed in us. We come to a deeper understanding of it, and we begin to offer it in our own lives in a new way. That the mystery kind of changes us over the course of time. And so, the mystery doesn't just change us, but it changes the world. So the Christian who looks at light and darkness, the end of the seasons, the kind of misery that we call winter in South Bend, that Christian can't help but see a sign of the light that shines in the darkness. And when you begin to celebrate Christmas, you see certain signs, the very cosmos participates in it. And this is kind of the way that the gospel spreads out to all of culture. That all of culture gets taken up in this. It's not just that the beauty of this time is that it's the historical time of a particular culture, of a particular place that comes to be taken up into this. And so you do have kind of, there's various ways that the liturgical year or season is kept. Obviously, in the Catholic Mass. So you have a cycle of feasts that continue again and again and again that are celebrated in the Mass, and people wear different colors. And you can kind of see that it's a visible manifestation that something is changing. There's also something called the Liturgy of the Hours, which is a prayer book, in which you pray a morning prayer, an evening prayer, afternoon prayer, night prayer, and that there's a specific prayer for each day. And that these prayers correspond, they change depending upon the season that we're in, the day that we're in, the time that we're in. So that the Christian marks time, the Christian numbers their days. Then there's also local feasts and festivals. When I was in Boston, they celebrated some version of Mary in my parish in Newton. Some Mary, I don't even actually was never quite sure what. But there was some feast of Mary in the middle of July that they celebrated in their village where everyone came from Italy. And so today they still celebrate this feast exactly as it was celebrated in the motherland, including a girl getting drawn up on a guide wire and dropping glitter on people's heads. I mean, that's what they did in the ancient world, so that's what they do now. But so what happens is that the feast itself begins to transform kind of ways of marking things. For us, I mean, on a more kind of less weird example, Christmas itself, obviously, is not necessarily anymore a Christian holiday any more than it is anything. But Christmas is also just, it's a general feast of kind of us. And what do? We light trees, and we put things under the trees. And presumably, we have a stocking. And we do all sorts of things at Christmas, and we have some weird old man sit in a mall and have children on his lap. I've always been freaked out by mall things, particularly Santa, but actually really, really the Easter Bunny. I think it's a disturbing image of a giant bunny entering your house. I think we shouldn't scare children with things like that. But maybe you do. I just have always envisioned, I mean, if you woke up in the middle of the night and a 6-foot-tall bunny walks in your door, you're not thinking, oh good, he's here to drop off some eggs. Well, I wouldn't. I'd be running. Okay, so this is kind of, so that the liturgical year is kind of something we can grasp, because we can see it, we can understand it, we have some experience of it. In Philly, even, around the Feast of St. Joseph, certain desserts are served in the Italian areas because St. Joseph is the patron saint of Italy, as in all saints, really, because they all claim them, the Italians, they want everything. And they have a party, which is not shocking. So, that there's these feasts that they kind of, that they're celebrated in the church, but then they come to spread out across the human life. All right, so in front of you, I don't know what I do. In front of you, I have a list of a kind of a liturgical year, what a year looks like. And this is from the liturgical season starts every year at Advent. So on November 27th, 2011, the church begins to celebrate a new year. Not on January 1st, but on November 27th, a new year comes around. And the year will go again until Christ the King in next year, November 25th, 2012. And then that next week, and then the next season of Advent starts. So this is kind of how the liturgical year looks for your own sake. And we'll talk a bit more of this in a second. But the liturgical year didn't develop like this. It just didn't, these seasons. Because the first day that was most important for Christians was Sunday. Because Sunday was the day that obviously Christ rose from the dead. And so that they would meet in places to pray. And so Sunday became interpreted very the first celebration of Easter was every Sunday. And there's still a lot of practices in churches that are kind of signs of this Sunday. So during Lent, when people are generally supposed to be fasting, as hard as this is for many people to believe, Sunday is a day where you don't fast, ever. Because Sunday is Resurrection Day. It's the day that Christ rose from the dead. And how can you fast on the day that Christ rose? Now, that doesn't mean you can gorge yourself, so that there's different degrees of feasting, right? So we have some feasts that are huge and some feasts that are smaller. So perhaps during Lent we don't eat a whole turkey for ourselves and drink 3 bottles of wine. but there is a kind of sense where we can't fast on these days. That there's a Sunday is the day when Christ rose from the dead, and Christians recognize this. But because we're humans, we have to have other things too. So very early on, Wednesday and Friday became special fast days. They were penitential days, but Friday in particular was viewed as a penitential day because it was the day that Christ died on the cross. So Christians would fast on this day, and in fact, still in the books, despite the fact that we don't keep it very often, is that on Fridays we're supposed to keep some penitential practice. We're supposed to do something, whether it's fasting, or doing a specific service, or changing some part of our lives that it's different than others, because it's a tangible, because we're bodily. And we have to do something bodily to recognize it. Like, I can't have general love for my wife. I can't say to her, I generally love you, or I think about loving you. I have a kind of principle of love. I consider it as important. No, I have to do something. I couldn't have become engaged by simply saying, aren't we engaged? No, there was a kind of action that was done. I gave a ring, I got on a knee. I didn't give her Tiffany crystal or tickets to a circus. I gave her an engagement ring. So that there's a sense in which we need matter to communicate. And so too, we need our bodies to say that this day is different. We mark time with our bodies. Then Easter and what we call the Paschal Triduum came. Quite naturally, Christians began to celebrate Easter, and there's a huge controversy which we don't have to get into, but Easter began around Pentecost, generally. Or not Pentecost, rather Passover. That it was marked according to the time of the Jewish calendar. And that soon what would develop is Christians, based upon their celebration in various cities, particularly the city of Jerusalem, began to mark these days as leading up to it. So you would mark Holy Thursday as the day in which Jesus had the Last Supper. You'd mark Good Friday as the day in which Christ died upon the cross. You'd mark Holy Saturday as the time of waiting, of expectation, of Christ in the tomb. You'd mark Easter Sunday as the day in which Christ rose from the dead. And then you'd mark the days after that, because to be honest, we're like really bad with feasting. So we have Christmas, and then it's like, oh, that was fun. So on December 26th, we get back to our normal mundane lives. The radio stations stop playing the crappy Christmas music, and people go to the store to return their things. The ancient people were better at feasting. It was 8 days long, every feast. That was really, 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 really big. So on Christmas, you would go, or on Christmas and Easter very soon after, you would go a full 8 days to celebrate it. And at Easter, so there's 8 days, which is called the octave of Easter, and then Easter was celebrated for another 50 days into Ascension and Pentecost. So Easter, this was a time specifically when the church didn't allow any fasting at all. You were not allowed to fast during these days. I mean, at least not fast as monks. So monks would have to do something a little different. So for a monk, not fasting might mean a little, like a piece of bread, or less days of fasting. Whereas for the Christian who might be living in the town or the world, this would mean that there was a kind of festivity to life as a whole for 50 full days. Well, obviously themes of Easter also resonated with certain sacraments, specifically baptism. In Paul's language, the dying to Christ and rising again. So that the Christian died to Christ and rose again when they went into the waters. Well, so Easter also became the baptismal season, kind of par excellence. And leading up to this season thus required you to prepare people. And hence the beginning of Lent. Lent is both a season for our penance, our penitential works, this time in which we prepare for Easter by using our bodies, by hungering, by fasting in specific ways, by giving of alms, by praying. We mark the time with our bodies. But it's also this special time of preparation for catechumens entering the church. So at the Basilica on this Easter, all these that are leading up to and preparing to enter the church will enter the church. And so Lent is a time in which, in many ways, the church keeps them specifically in mind. And so then there was Ascension and Pentecost, which we talk about. But even before Christmas, Christmas is a much later feast. You have the birthday of martyrs, which is kind of an ironic thing. They called it the Dies Natalis, the day of birth for the martyrs. But it wasn't actually the day of birth, it was their day of death. So when the martyr died, a gradual practice began to occur that you would go to the martyr's tomb and you would celebrate Mass on the day of their death, or their day of the birth into heaven. And this is how martyrs' days, those who died for their faith, gradually came to be we developed saints. Because you would celebrate saint days on the days of their death. And so this is kind of the birth of kind of all those saints that we celebrate. Then you had Advent, Christmas. You had Christmas first, which was the feast of Christ's birth. Then you had Epiphany, which is actually only celebrated in the West as the three wise men coming. In the East, they don't celebrate that feast. They celebrate Epiphany, which is also the baptism of the Lord. For us, for Western Christians, including Lutherans, Catholics, the whole gang, celebrate two different feasts. Epiphany, when the wise men bring these trinkets to Jesus, not just trinkets, but gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They're really signs of death and kingship. I think we think of them as like cute little toys that you brought to infant Jesus, but the Gospels are always much darker than we imagine them to be. And so they're already a sign that Christ will die, because you use that to wrap his body to prepare for burial. Myrrh is not a spice of, myrrh is for death. Okay, so you have Epiphany, and then you have the baptism of the Lord, where Christ descended into the waters and came back up. And in the East, they celebrate this differently, and Orthodox Christians will all drink some of the baptismal water on this day. So Christmas actually goes up for us until the baptism of the Lord, which this year, because of the lateness of Christmas on a Sunday, is the 9th of January. So students won't be here for that. And then you have other feasts of Christ, like the Presentation of the Lord, the Transfiguration. Marian feast days develop, the Assumption of Mary into heaven, which is a specifically Catholic and Orthodox feast. So some Protestants would have it, others would not. And then you have the Annunciation of Mary on March 25th. This one is actually pretty cool. Why do you think, just using your best brains, that the moment in which Mary is told she's going to bear Christ, why do you think that feast is celebrated on March 25th? Very good. So that it's 9 months before Christmas. So that's why the Annunciation occurs there. And John the Baptist, the Feast of John the Baptist, is June 24th, which is for a lot of reasons. It's precisely a little under 6 months until the Feast of Christmas. And what does John say? But I must decrease that he might increase. So at the very moment of the year in which the sun begins to decrease the amount that it shines, we celebrate the Feast of John the Baptist. And on Christmas, the very moment in which light begins to increase, we celebrate the Feast of Christmas, where the light shone into the darkness, and the darkness could not conquer it. So you see, Christians are actually we use the cosmos in a kind of really cool way to mark these feasts. And so these are what these seasons are about. And then this is the present day structure. So I've given it to you as a way to say, I wonder where we are. Maybe I don't have Peter Rocca in the Basilica. Father Peter Rocca publishes a massive book called the Ordo every year that tells you exactly where you are in the world. But maybe you don't want to read Peter Rocca's book, or you don't have a copy of it. But you can have a copy of this, which is just a little calendar telling you where we are right now, or where we'll be for liturgical feasts. And I marked it by colors because we wear different colors at different times in the church. So purple is the season of Advent. Gold for big feast days related to Mary. Christmas it's gold or white. It's kind of a gold and white look. Green for ordinary time. We wear rose 2 Sundays, though a lot of the priests don't like to. They just view it as less manly, but get over it. Gaudete Sunday on the 3rd Sunday of Advent, and Laetare Sunday on the 4th Sunday of Lent. And that's where the Laetare medal gets its name that we give out every year. It actually is given always on the 4th Sunday of Lent. So that's where it gets its name. Red for feast days related to the cross and to martyrs and to that sort of thing. And then there's one day where you can still wear black. You can wear black at funerals technically, but gold and white is kind of the more visible image. But black on All Souls Day, which was on November 2nd this year, you can still wear black. And I remember very specifically when I was here on 9/11, Father Malloy wore black for that Mass, for the dead, when we celebrated the Mass on September 11th, 2001. All right, so those are just the structures. Are there any broad questions before we kind of get into what I think is more important for all of you? Insights, concerns? All right. So why does the liturgical year matter for a Catholic university? To be honest, it's not like we actually are set up to celebrate the liturgical year. We arrive in the middle of August, and we leave by the end of May, which is often during the middle of Easter. We go home for Christmas, and so most of the students who are here, or even us, kind of want to have a Christmas party kind of just a bit early, which I'm fine with, by the way. I'm not one of those people who say you can't have a Christmas party till Christmas. Screw that. Christmas is pleasant. It's fun to have cookies. So what is the purpose kind of the liturgical year within a Catholic university? First, it reminds us the centrality of Christ to the Catholic university's character. No matter how much we want to become an excellent research university, no matter how much we strive to be a place for excellence in all sort of facets of university life, we can't get over the fact that when we say we're a Catholic university, that somehow this connects us to Christ's life. That somehow, that what we do across our entire kind of work as a university, across student formation, in campus ministry, in the educational sphere, it somehow connects to discipleship in Christ. Now, for those students who are not Christian, this is not a threat to them, because it's an invitation. And in many ways, this is the beauty of the liturgical year. It's a performance that one can partake in. And I find it a very attractive kind of performance, one that kind of enters one into a way of life if you're attentive to it. But it's not demanding. It doesn't say you have to do this. That the Catholic university best exhibits its connection to Christ simply by celebrating these feasts and making them public manifestations. Like every year in the dining hall, there is inevitably a letter to the observer around Lent about how these terrible totalitarian leaders have said that there's not going to be meat again this year in the dining hall, though there is in Burger King and everywhere else on campus. But in the dining hall, you can't eat meat. Well, guess what? I don't care. I mean, it's a visible sign of what something is happening, of a deep belief system. Because again, human beings don't simply profess knowledge in general. We do something to perform it. And so to not have meat in the dining hall during Lent is to say we are on Fridays during Lent. And by the way, the food is much better in the dining hall on Fridays during Lent when they have to be creative than it is the rest of the year. But we'll leave that out. My favorite dining hall day was always the Lenten feast, which was kind of a contradiction in terms when they had really expensive fish on one Friday. But anyway, so really that there's certain markers that we have that and maybe it's most visible, particularly here, on that the Triduum. Notre Dame is a beautiful place because the Triduum, the celebration of Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter, actually there's a changeable mark of time here. You can almost feel that the place has recommitted itself to something else. That it's not about simply academics or athletics or all these sorts of things, but that the whole university community is kind of dedicated to this one thing, this contemplation of Christ. One that we hope will transform every other thing that students do, that faculty do, that staff do here at the university. 2, student formation into visible Catholic identity and practice. We at least profess to be 85% Catholic as a school. Nobody knows anything about what Catholic practice is anymore. There's studies done. I have studied the work of a sociologist here, Christian Smith, on this very topic. That in many ways, people don't know things about the faith anymore. That it's not, and I did this, I interviewed 90 students for the Notre Dame Vision program, and it's not simply kind of now at this point in time like theoretical knowledge that I read in a book, it's the knowledge of actually interviewing 90 students and asking them questions like, who is Christ to you? And hearing things like Christ is like there when I'm there, and when I need him, he's there. but there's no kind of concrete, kind of actual statements about Christ. Now, this is fine for some of the students, but for those who are interviewing to be in a retreat program, presumably they know something about Jesus. And that there's a kind of practice that's forgotten that is to be kind of reclaimed. That there's a way that Catholic identity sometimes gets to be intellectualized alone. That we think of Catholic identity solely as a matter of, well, do we teach this philosophy course? Or are we educating our student athletes in kind of an ethical life? Or do we treat our employee, or is there leadership and excellence? I don't know what that means, but that's the beauty of being on the faculty side. I can say most things without having to worry about consequences. So is there leadership and excellence? Those are all very fine things, but there's Catholic specificity. There's certain specific practices that when you enter a place, that what makes Notre Dame Catholic isn't a kind of idea. It's a group of people who go to the grotto on a night because when they're faced with the most sorrowful moments in their life, that's what they do. It's the masses that are set on campus. It's the group of people who are there to support and pray for one another in difficult times. That's what, and the liturgical year gives us a way to kind of form people in these practices, these ways of being Catholic. Finally, there are all these saint days throughout the year. And I think we talk a lot about, in both the academy and on the other side of the university, of trying to get students to be critical thinkers, to not simply accept certain cultural norms as the norm. So you don't have to be a consumer or producer alone, but that you can do something else with your life. That you can enter into a business situation and transform it. That you don't have to simply kind of take this ethics as face value, but can kind of challenge it. That you can enter into those Fight For commercials. That's kind of what we have. But isn't it in some way that the saint is kind of the icon of what we want our students to be? And so that by the celebration of the saints over the course of a year, isn't there a way that we kind of unfold what the most excellent human being looks like? That the most excellent human being loves in this way, is willing to enter into the poorest situation, is willing to go and study to the point that they can, but never studying for the sake of studying alone, but for a sake of wonder and a desire to know and a desire to love God and neighbor more. So that the saint becomes a kind of icon of who we desire to become. And so the liturgical year reminds us, it presents for us a kind of imagery both in Christ, in Mary, in those other saints of who we desire to become. And those are just three things that I think might be helpful to think about. And I just want to wrap up then, before discussions, with just a little bit of a, it's okay, what would that look like? What were some of these things that would look like? How can this actually affect? So we're about to enter Advent and Christmas. And these are some of my favorite times of years. Not the imminent darkness, not the arrival of snow, not the sudden shoveling and the sadness of a cloud that comes to reside over us and dwell here, like Mordor, for 4 or 5 months. Rather, there's a way in which we can even transform this on campus. See, in the Northern Hemisphere, we really can't celebrate the Feast of Advent and Christmas without thinking about this looming reality of winter. That staring into such darkness, it's kind of remarkable that we respond with festivity. Illuminated Christmas decor pierces through the increasingly long nights, often hung shoddily on dorms throughout this campus, as we perform the Twilight Carnival through holiday parties and family celebrations. As the earth slows down around us, as death enacts its cosmic play, we respond with a comedy of light. For truly, the darkness cannot conquer the ones created for the light. Yet, is there not some sense in which we, in kind of contemporary modern culture, have a difficulty in recognizing the source of this light? Our midwinter carnival can become a kind of end to itself, a burning heat without a flame. We turn to the modern temple par excellence, the mall, in which the source of light becomes the unfilled desire of the consumer. If only we had this perfume, this newest gadget from Apple, this new coat, then we'd truly be in the light. Yet the perfume runs out. The novelty of the gadget wears away. The coat frays with wear. Can this transient matter, so quick to become darkness, be the source of our light? Perhaps, though, we're better than that. We recognize we don't need stuff. But our greatest desire is not for the material comfort of the mall, but for hope from the respite from the complexities of modern life, surely which none of you deal with. That if we decorate our homes and buy our gifts and prepare our meals and send our Christmas cards, then we can know the true rest of Christmas, which lasts exactly here for 2 weeks. But our homes are never perfect, and our gifts need to be returned. And our meals with family rarely turn out as we imagine, and if you're with my family, they actually do turn out as we imagine them, but they're never quite as bucolic as kind of you watch it in movies. Although, I guess the end of the beautiful holiday film is over. Now they're only sad and miserable. Or families fighting and kind of things like that. And our Christmas cards remain in the drawer unopened and unaddressed for yet another year. And as the dawn of December 26th arrives, as stores begin to accept returns and sell their wares at half price, and the music from the radio stops playing, the cacophony of jingle bells, and we wish you a Merry Christmas, does not the attentive soul notice a sense of sadness? That amid our festival of light, the darkness remains. The beauty of the season of Advent for the student, for the faculty member, for the staff here on campus, as it's celebrated, is that these prayers, these activities, do not deny that the human being continues to experience the darkness. They do not seek to cover up, the church doesn't seek to cover up our unfulfilled desire or hope for light in the midst of gloom. Rather, they direct us. The church's practice, the liturgical year, directs us to consider the true source of light, of humanity's ultimate desire in the God-man Jesus Christ. One way to do so in particular, I think, is in the prayers for this season, that the light shines in the darkness. So the church prays on the second Sunday of Advent. May the splendor of your glory dawn in our hearts, we pray, Almighty God, that all the shadows of the night may be scattered, and we may be shown to be children of light by the advent of your only begotten Son. Or on Christmas itself, at Mass during the night, more popularly known as Midnight Mass, we pray the following. O God, who have made this sacred night radiant with the splendor of the true light, grant, we pray, that we who have known the mysteries of his light on earth may also delight in his gladness in heaven. And at dawn, as the light begins to increase over the heavens, grant, we pray, Almighty God, that as we are bathed in the new radiance of your incarnate word, the light of faith, which illumines our minds, may also shine through in our deeds. In these prayers, the image of light and darkness are operative. There's the darkness natural to the night, the first rays of sun natural to the dawning morn. In this play of light and darkness, the cosmic quality to the feast of Christmas is recalled. The earth itself participates in this feast. The play of light and darkness becomes signs of Christ's transformation of the created world. Night is never night alone, but the attitude of expectation intrinsic to being a person of faith. Day is never day alone, but a sign of Christ's transformation of the created world. We take up these signs during Advent. We help us to look again at the cosmos anew, to see that all can participate in this kind of new light in Christ. And the beauty of it, I think, in many ways, is that we are to become this light. That the liturgical year shows us who we are to become. It gives us a vision of what we are to aspire to. And I think that's really kind of the purpose of our celebration of it. We don't pretend that Christ is born again. We don't shoot down. We don't like have Jesus come in from the back of church on like a guide wire and land in the nativity at the front of the church. It's not a pretend game. Rather, Christ comes again as Christ is born in the hearts of those who perceive the mystery and desire to become what they receive in it. So this is just some reflections on the liturgical year, and I think they could be helpful as this group continues to think about what it means for Notre Dame to be the type of university that recognizes these things as important. That if we really are to be a kind of unique university, it's through this particularity that we can learn how to ourselves shine in the darkness. Because if we don't focus on the particularity, then the inevitable temptation is to get rid of all that makes us particular and just embrace what's popular, what sounds cool, what sells. And that feasts like the liturgical year can kind of form us in this new way of thinking, or the liturgical year can form us in this particularity. So I think at this point, it's 2:22, so this will be, you have 8 minutes until you probably have to go to your next thing in your life that's of equal importance. So perhaps just general reactions, what you think, how you kind of came to some insights of where you are and what you're doing and how something like this might help, or even just questions, though I can't promise I'll be able to answer them. Does anyone want to be called on? It's worse, isn't it? You want to be better than the undergraduates. Yes?
How did they come up with the term ordinary time? As that flows in and out of all the other celebrations, in and out. I mean, how did they, or is that a translation of something, or, you know, when we all go back to the priest is wearing green again, or whatever.
Right.
Ordinary time.
It didn't used to be called ordinary time. It used to be called the Sunday after, it turns out I didn't need water. It's the Sunday, it used to be, now I'm less sure of this because I actually wasn't alive when it was like this, but it was the time after Christmas, or you would measure time by Christmas to Pentecost, or the time after Pentecost to the Feast of Holy Cross, which is on September 14th, I think. And then you would measure time from the Feast of Holy Cross to Advent. So that was the two kind of ordinary times. Ordinary time, presumably, although I actually haven't looked at it, is a translation from Latin. And what it kind of is an unfair statement, because it just sounds like, oh, now we're in boring time. And often the homilies sound like that. But that's not the kind of time, what ordinary kind of means is that there's a kind of ordinariness to it in that it's not celebrated as that there is not a feast. So for a Christian, really, there is no ordinary time. All time is sacred, but there's no kind of Christian feast that's being celebrated. So it's the kind of ordinary time of the Christian. And often what this means is you kind of just read the life of Jesus, the kind of parables and the ministry of Jesus as you move through this kind of lectionary of readings, or the official assigned readings for this time. So that's what is meant by ordinary. I don't know why that was chosen, and I'd have to look at that. But it doesn't mean, another thing that you can think about as ordinary is it comes from to order, a kind of ordering, a kind of orientation. So perhaps a better way of looking at ordinary time is to look at the time that orders us in the kind of, there's no extra feast to be celebrated. It's just the consideration of what constitutes a decent Christian life.
Question regarding saints. What determines, like I know some saints are considered major saints and some saints are considered minor. How does this hierarchy become developed?
Right. Well, it was developed pretty early on. Martyrs were big saints. All martyrs were big saints. Anyone who died for their faith. Apostles were big saints because they were the ones who passed on this tradition. Then there were the saints that obviously had universal applicability for the church. So Ignatius of Loyola on July 31st is one of those saints. Huge potential to kind of transform the whole church. Then there are other saints like that. So Dominic, Benedict. These are the kind of saints that are kind of universally spirituality kind of. And as much as, so then there are saints that are more local. And it's kind of hard to say this here, but I'll use this as an example. Saint Andre is a fairly low on the order of the saints, in that Saint Andre is a saint of a particular congregation in particular who has a specific devotion to him. So his feast is to be celebrated particularly in the United States and Canada. So if you're in the middle of Guatemala in January, I think it's 6th, 7th, something like that. Oh yeah, it is January 6th, which is even funnier because January 6th in the rest of the world is the Feast of the Epiphany. And St. Andre's feast day is January 6th, which means he'll never be celebrated in the rest of the world at all. Only in the United States where we moved the Feast of Epiphany to a Sunday. So that there was a kind of recognition that it was based upon the devotion of the people who would gather around that saint or blessed. So Blessed John Paul II is technically, because he's blessed and not even a saint yet, only supposed to be celebrated in the Diocese of Rome, which is where his cause was instituted. But because people know him so well and there's this kind of universal acclaim to celebrate him, there's lots of dioceses, and basically the whole United States is asked to celebrate his feast day. So that's kind of how you order it.
Does it change from year to year or from decade to decade?
It doesn't really change from... Sunday beats every saint, except John the Baptist and Mary. That's it. So every other saint gets beaten by Sunday. So there are years where Ignatius's feast is not celebrated, or it's transferred for Jesuits to the next week. So it does change like that, but it doesn't change. It's generally been widely recognized. The other thing is that there's recent reforms of saints, because John Paul II, I think, canonized on the present calendar, I think it's an obscene number of saints, like 2/3 of the calendar of saints John Paul II canonized. Like, to canonize a saint used to be a big deal, in the sense of, like, it only happened now and again. John Paul II canonized saints like 15 at a time, like every couple weeks. So you have this huge number of saints now. So on any saint day, if you go to like a calendar, and there's actually a book for the saints on this, there are like 25 saints listed. And some of the saints are from this little local Italian village, and they'll never be known by a single human being in the world outside of that little village. And other saints are kind of universally recognized. So part of it is kind of, it's devotion of the people, formal recognition in a book, so when books are revised, they can actually, I suppose, change how the feast is to be celebrated.
How about holy days of obligation, and how are those determined, and have those changed over time? There used to be more. You think there will be more?
There did used to be more. Americans have holy days of obligation. They're mostly all on here. So Immaculate Conception is a holy day of obligation. Christmas is a holy day of obligation. Mary, Mother of God, is a holy day of obligation. The Feast of the Annunciation is a holy day of obligation. By the way, Ash Wednesday is not a holy day of obligation, though it's the most widely attended day of Mass in the country, because people like to get free things from church. Wow, there's really not that many. Transfiguration is a holy day of obligation. No, Transfiguration is not a holy day of obligation. Assumption of Mary is a holy day of obligation. And All Saints' Day is a holy day of obligation. That's it. And the Ascension is a holy day of obligation when it's not on a Sunday. But if it's on a Sunday, it's always a holy day of obligation. In the United States, most of the dioceses have moved it. There is a move in Europe. There used to be tons of holy days of obligation. In the medieval period, you never worked. There were so many holy days of obligation. And because when a feast occurred, it was a multi-day affair, and you would get off for like 3 or 4 days. And so these little towns, it was a fairly leisurely life outside of the imminent fear of death, which struck everyone. Holy Days of Obligation have decreased gradually because there's this fear that Americans in particular won't like go to church twice in a row or that sort of stuff. So there is a movement in particular, for example, particular countries to increase these visible signs of holiness. I always think about it like I lived in a Jewish neighborhood where I lived in Boston, and there was something about watching the entire community of Jewish people in my area go to their synagogue on Yom Kippur. And to just see all these people gathering in as a kind of a tangible sign that like, oh, they're marking some time that's different than the time that I mark. So there is these movements in particularly Europe and this desire to see more tangible signs of this, so increased Holy Days of Obligation, movements of ascension away from Sunday back to Thursday, but local national bishops decide that. So the U.S. bishops decide that. The other thing that may be coming back very, 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 very soon, actually, is no meat on every Friday. England has returned to the practice. I've returned to the practice sometime when I was studying it, because I realized I kind of like to mark time with my body. It wasn't about penance alone. It was just kind of a daily reminder of a way. As I thought, oh, I don't eat meat on Friday, I thought, oh, why don't I eat meat on Friday? You know, it just keeps me, when I go to Grace and I'm about to get some delicious meat sandwich or something, it just makes me think like, oh, why am I not? So that actually, I think in 5 years, that could be that could be returned nationally. It'll be interesting to see what happens at Notre Dame when that occurs.
What are your thoughts on the return to some of this dialogue, universal dialogue that are actually, to me, are going back to old terms? There's one term in our new liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
I bet 90% of the people in the church aren't going to know what it means.
Consubstantial.
I mean,
yeah, I mean, my own reaction is also no one knew what one and being with the Father was. So I don't think anyone is more confused by one and being with the Father than consubstantial. I mean, the Latin says consubstantia, and that's why it was translated that way. So it's not a going back. It's just it's a closer translation, I would say.
it's a closer translation, but I think when we respond, it really is different from the English context
Sure.
than it was before. And it's
Yeah.
like,
I mean, my own personal opinion that people are making a bigger deal. I don't think most people understand 90% what they do in church anyway, 95.
which is
So, so I think, well, there are some that I like, some I don't. Consubstantial's one. I think consubstantial offers more hope than one in being, because I don't think anyone knows what one in being is. So,
depends.
yeah.
We want to be real conscious of time. I think it's we're on 2:30 right now. So if you have other questions, I'm sure Dr. O'Malley will stay for a little bit to answer those. Couple things reminders, if you haven't signed up for CEUs and you're interested, please do so. Soon you'll be hearing about our next book for the Star and Book Club. I think right after Thanksgiving you'll hear about that. And again, look for our calendar in the spring. Thanks, Dr. O'Malley.
And you guys can just call me Tim.